Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
And we're recording today because we can't figure out how to use the internet. And like the rest of the world, it's gone mad, so why not join it? Today what we wanted to do is just take some time to think through and talk about this idea of submission. Submission has been probably a concept that our culture, number one, it disdains because it rejects authority. And number two, to talk about submission means that you are being asked to come under someone, to voluntarily choose to follow. And as a result of that, people feel that their autonomy is lost. We're in a moment of crisis in our day where people are struggling with all sorts of submission. So Gary, we haven't planned out this conversation, so we'll have it just free-flowing and we'll see where this goes. So when we think about the idea of submission, so I've mentioned a couple of ideas why people struggle with submission. I've kind of maybe given a basic definition as to what it is. Anything that you would add to what a definition of submission would be?
Maybe I want to emphasize a couple of points that you've already made, just to make sure that we're, I think, stressing what needs to be stressed. It's not a hard word. I think people kind of know it in common parlance. We talk about children submitting to parents, for instance. You use the word willfully, and I think that's an important qualification, that biblical submission presumes that it is a moral agent, human, that is making that submission. I think of Ephesians 5, where it talks about wives submitting to husbands. And so we could talk about what submission is, also what it isn't. So I think the concerns that are expressed are often concerns that are considering submission in a way that is non-biblical. So, for instance, wives submit to husbands. That is in the context of, one, a loving marriage, a husband that lays his life down for his wife and loves his wife as Christ loves the church. And the wife, the woman, submits to her husband. But that submission is not one that is forced upon her.
That's right.
It is, the Greek uses a technical term here, the middle voice, that implies moral agency that the woman has, that she is making an active choice of her own will to submit to that husband. So I think those are important considerations, that one, it is a choice that we make. It's one that the Lord asks us to do willingly, rather than something that is prescribed legally or out of obligation. It's a moral choice that we make.
Yeah, so if there's coercion, that then ceases to be submission in its truest sense.
That's right.
That if I'm demanding that you submit, that becomes tyranny. That's an abuse of power. It's authoritarianism, but it is certainly not submission. It's not. There's no opportunity to submit.
I guess the other thing, and one that I was thinking of when you were first starting out, is that the thing that really rankles us is that because there is a yielding one to another, there's a yielding of one person to another, or one person to an institution, if you will, a government, that we apply value to that equation immediately in our minds and in our society, that the one who yields to another is also acknowledging that I am lesser in value than this person. And that's not godly either.
That's right.
Not the way the biblical model of submission speaks of. That's not what it speaks of.
Yeah, and that's, I think, a very important distinction, because for many people, to submit means I feel that I am less worthy or valuable, whereas submission is an acknowledgement of authority, and authority does not equal superiority.
Right.
It just means that there has been responsibility that has been given that needs to be exercised in the right way, and the person coming under that authority is responding rightly to good authority.
Yeah.
So that's helpful for us, because in our day and age, there are all sorts of questions that come about submission, and we really haven't had to think through. Well, we've talked as a church a little bit about what we believe about men and women are equal yet distinct and different in complementing roles to one another. It doesn't make one better or worse. It makes us different. But we haven't had to think about this so much as in the realm of the church and the state. And this is becoming an increasingly complex question. Maybe what are some factors that are pressing in on us right now, Gary, that are causing this question to be raised to such a hackle for so many people?
Right. So it's the pandemic, obviously, that has put probably the greatest spotlight on issues of submission, because the government has said that for the good of society, we are strongly recommending it. They're generally not banning or prohibiting certain things, but it's this language of really, we strongly suggest that you don't do certain things like a travel, or when you go out, well, in fact, they, I think, mandated that you wear a mask when you're in public. That's a civic responsibility, and London has certainly said that.
Yeah.
So other types of restrictions that have been imposed or suggested upon our living that we're not accustomed to, and we're not accustomed to the government having that kind of say in what we wear when we go outside, how many people are allowed into a church service, for instance, and that's new to us.
Yeah, we've forgotten, I think, to some degree, that we submitted all the time to governmental regulations. We have this beautiful building, and there's a fire code, and we follow fire code. We have an inspection of this building done every single year. There's so many people that can fit into this room with non-fixed seating, with tables and chairs, and we have to abide by that. And that's not done because the government is twisting our arms, but we do that because we recognize there's a wisdom principle that should a fire break out, or should there be some sort of hazard, to get people out of the room quickly, safely, that those guidelines have been established. So we follow those guidelines willingly because we know that they're there for our good. But suddenly we come along these restrictions as it's related to COVID, and we're responding differently. Why do you think that is, Gary?
Yeah, I think it has touched nerves within perhaps particularly the evangelical community, if I use that term very broadly. People that take, in general, Christians that take the Bible seriously, and their faith and their worship is an important part of their life. It's something that is something they identify. It's part of their identity.
Yeah.
And so when the government puts a finger on that in any way, that is going to feel personal in a way that maybe the speed limits that we obey or don't obey don't feel very personal. We've tried to really, I think, work hard to distinguish between those actions of the government that are particularly disadvantaging either certain sectors or certainly churches, versus those things that are broad in their application. And so you can't say that they are picking on or disadvantaging the church as opposed to other areas of industry. We've tried, I think, to really be careful in how in the things that we question, either publicly or behind the scenes, those things that we support. And I think that's one principle that we've tried to, I think, operate under as elders for the church, is when the government is not disadvantaging Christians as opposed to other areas of society, then we are willing to submit.
Yeah, we've seen that. Like, I think we've tried to give our governing officials the benefit of the doubt, and we recognize that it's incredibly complex. We've tried to be patient. We've seen various sectors, like the restaurant industry, has been disadvantaged at points. So it doesn't matter the square footage of a restaurant. A small shop can have 10 people, and a big hall can have only 10 people when they're in the red zone. And it was right for restaurant owners to push against that and to say there seems to be an inconsistency, whereas churches have had the privilege of a 30% capacity. So in that case, we weren't disadvantaged like the restaurant industry was.
Right.
Now, submission is easy to do when things are going well. We have no problem when we agree with regulations, when we see the wisdom of it. But submission actually faces its true test when we have a hard time with it or when we disagree with it.
Yeah.
So, Gary, let's maybe just work out some principles here. When we're thinking about when we're disagreeing with directives that are being given to us, Paul says in Romans 13, we're to submit to governing authorities, or obviously not called to submit to governing authorities if it calls us to disobey the Lord.
Right.
So we must obey God rather than men. I think that's Acts 5:29. But Paul does say in Romans 13, I think it's verse 2, that you should be careful that you submit to the governing authorities, because to disobey the governing authorities is to disobey the authority that God has given. So there's a very fine line, isn't there? That we need to obey governing authorities, but there are points where we need to obey God rather than men. But we need to be very clear and careful about when we're crossing that line. What are some of those principles then we could start to think through and articulate? When are we crossing that line from obeying the government and disobeying God or it's fine to submit to governing authorities?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So hear us very clearly. The Bible calls us to submit to ruling authorities.
That's right.
That's very clear. We can look at Romans 13. We can look at 1 Peter chapter 2. And yet, we use Scripture to interpret Scripture, in Acts 5:29 as the counterbalance to that we must obey God rather than man. And so hear us that there are times when we're going to have to make that call. It's a call of conscience. And so I think it's good you use the word principles. What are some principles? One, I think we mentioned this last week, but since we didn't have the microphone on, I'll say it again.
It was brilliant last week, by the way.
Yeah, it was the best one ever. One helpful saying that I've learned myself, and I try to apply it, is that if the government was forbidding what God commands or commands what God forbids.
Right.
That's a great place to start in terms of a principle, Andrew. So for instance, if the government forbade worship, public gathering of Christians, then I would say that would be a place for civil disobedience. And here's where it gets a little nuanced in terms of COVID. But before we get to the COVID application, Andrew, you and I both know that, and perhaps we even know people that are in house churches worldwide. There are places in the world that forbid the gathering, the public expression of the Christian faith. And so in places like that, Christians have typically gone underground. That's how they deal with it. They have underground house churches, or in businesses where part of the business is set aside for church on Sabbath. That's how they deal with it. They civilly disobey because the Lord commands us to meet. Where we have been, I think, more nuanced is, and some people have asked us, well, how do you guys feel about Hebrews chapter 10, for instance, 10:25, which says, don't forsake the fellowship one with another. Is that not what the government's doing when they go into a hard lockdown and tell us we can't meet?
Right.
And we have seen that with, I guess, a more nuanced interpretation, where we would say Hebrews 10 is talking about the forsaking of fellowship, where we are choosing to abandon the fellowship. We have walked away from it as a disposition of our own hearts, and we don't, when we're allowed to gather, we choose not to. And so a temporary suspension of gathering for the sake of our either our own personal well-being, because we're not healthy, so we don't want to come in and
That's right.
spread the flu to somebody else, or for the sake of community. And that's how we have seen that, Andrew. And,
Yeah.
and I think I'm very clear in my conscience on that. And I know some of our congregation has struggled with that, and they would wish we'd have a harder stance and just meet always, regardless of what the government says. But that's been our position of conscience there.
Yeah, and so as we've tried to work that principle out, we recognize that there's all sorts of various components to this. People are going to have certain perspectives about this pandemic and its severity or lack thereof from their perspective. The PCR tests, that's another piece that people raise in terms of what's a case, what's an incident of COVID. And so these become highly politicized pieces, and we've tried to not get into the highly politicized pieces. Rather, what we've tried to do is we've tried to recognize that the call to submit is hardest when it's going against our freedoms. Right. And we're asked to surrender some of our freedoms for the sake of the public good. We haven't been asked to permanently relinquish those freedoms. If we were to be asked to permanently relinquish those freedoms that God has commanded us to meet, then certainly there are lines there that we draw.
Right.
And we're clear on that. But where that line gets drawn is much more difficult. And some people will draw that line sooner. Other people will draw that line later. And I think it's helpful to recognize like you use the phrase, there's a conscience issue here. And some people have a stronger and some people have a weaker conscience.
Yeah.
And so acknowledging that there are a lot of conscience issues here becomes really key in this whole interpretation.
Yeah, and if I could say what will work, we don't rely merely on conscience, because if the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness, as Paul says, right, in the Corinthians. So I think one word of caution I would give as a pastor would be, and I'm pulling this from Scripture. Like when I read 1 Peter 2, for instance, I recommend you read that. It's a hard read, because we would often say, well, my line will be drawn along justice lines, for instance. There's no one should ever submit to unjust authority. Well, you can't read 1 Peter 2 and come to that conclusion. I'm not suggesting that there's never a time to say no to injustice. Paul, for instance, we both know, like, he once asserted or affirmed, like, hey, I'm a Roman citizen. You're not allowed to beat me. And so he exercised that right as a Roman citizen to escape an injustice. But there are other times when God clearly says it's for his own glory and for his own purposes that we choose to submit even to unjust authority. That's really hard to read, and I can't command you in a given instance what that looks like for you as a believer. But I want to caution you against only using your own personal comfort or ease as the arbiter as to whether submission is right or not. Sometimes submission is going to be hard. It'll cost you something. It'll cost you something perhaps physically or emotionally or financially to honor the Lord.
Well, and so that's a good point, Gary, because in 1 Peter 2, 13, I think through 15, Peter talks about honoring the emperor. And if we name the emperor, it's Nero.
Yeah.
Nero was not a friend to Christians. He fed them to the lions. He blamed the burning of Rome on Christians. He ultimately had Peter killed, crucified upside down, and he saw Christianity as a public threat, a threat to the public good. And Peter said, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution and to honor the emperor. So I do think that there are some good principles that Peter drives out. The way that we talk about Premier Ford, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, it should be honorable. We can disagree with them, but they are people made in the image of God, and there is no place for us to be calling them names or to be slanderous of them. that they have difficult positions, and we ought to pray for them. We ought to submit to them as much as we are able to. But Peter also goes on and he talks about silencing others by doing good. And that's in the context, Gary, of hardships.
Yes.
So we'll face threats to our freedoms and rights, and Peter says, do good. To live as people who are free.
Endure sorrows while suffering unjustly.
Yes.
It's hard to read that, but that's in our scriptures.
So what does that, let's maybe try to flesh that out just in the last, we'll take a couple extra minutes here.
Yeah.
What does it look like to do good when you're suffering for it, especially in these days?
Yeah, so I think there's a tension that we can operate within. So submission can look hard in certain circumstances, even unjust submission. It doesn't preclude working behind the scenes or in addition to your submission to win the other side, as it were. Scriptures talk about, say, in a marriage situation, the wife winning the husband, for instance. That winning, that implies that there's persuasion going on. It's not a subjugation of your brain, your will. That submission, yes, there will be an act of submission that, as I've been saying, costs you something. You're in disagreement with it. But even as you're doing that, you can be persuading in respectful ways to try to win your brother, to try to win your spouse, to try to win the government over. We've seen an example of that, actually, Andrew, with churches that, there are churches that have been in the news a lot for very public stances they've taken, but there are churches and advocacy groups advocating for churches behind the scenes, very respectfully and working with the government. And we've seen the government move. For instance, when we're in gray zone, we're allowed to meet now as churches. That right. Wasn't always the case. The government relented and agreed with our constitutional challenge that we should be allowed to meet.
Well, and there's also the aspects too where as Christians have engaged with public officials and health officials, they've done so with gentleness and respect. And I think that's part of the good that Peter talks about as well.
Right.
That a harsh word, Proverbs 15:1, a harsh word stirs up anger, but a gentle answer turns away wrath. And if we remember that when we're interacting with public officials, whether in the health unit or in the government, there are times where I've encountered there's a believer and they have received severe criticism from other Christians, and it's been really painful, and it's hurt them, and it's hurt the public witness of Christ. Whereas if we approach with questions, with sincere questions, with a desire to work for the public good, that we are remembering the dignity of the person who is in the position where we're interacting, we can do a lot of good. James will talk about how don't you know that the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God? And that's just the thing that we're so tempted to, is when we lose our rights, we want to be angry, and we want to express that anger in inappropriate ways, thinking that our forcefulness will be persuasive to change someone, but it doesn't. It's a gentle answer that turns away wrath. It's the reasonable person who works through those systems. Now there comes a point where that may not work, and that may require a different approach, but the general principle is gentleness and respect always is doing good.
I think one other aspect that Peter mentions, so in terms of how do I do that, we're not by nature gentle.
Right.
And so one interesting qualification he makes here, and this is in First Peter 2:19, for it is a gracious thing when one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Now I've missed one clause there, and that is mindful of God. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows, suffering unjustly. In chapter 4 of this book, he speaks of the way in which we're to serve one another, because all have been given gifts, and we serve with the strength God supplies. And so to do this outside of God's supplying of strength, and outside of having a mindfulness for God, think of what Jesus endured, for instance, on the cross. Think of what he endured when he was slandered, when he was accused wrongly. How was he himself before Pilate, for instance? How did he answer for himself? What did he speak of? And I think that's, so we've got the example of the Lord, but we also have his very strength that allows us to suffer graciously.
And that's how Peter ends chapter 2. He says, for this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. In other words, this is the example of Christ that we follow. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, and there is the greatest injustice of all, that he takes our punishment, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. And so Christ is not only our example for how to live in the midst of injustice, to live when we disagree with authority, because he perfectly obeyed his Father as he was here on earth, and he went to the cross for us. So in all things, our prayer and our desire pastorally is that you could be strengthened and encouraged to continue in the faith, in gentleness and courageousness and boldness and winsomeness, so that Jesus Christ, by your good deeds, would be made known to your friends and neighbors and even to our government. So thanks for joining us today, and I hope this has been helpful for you. As always, if you've got questions, it's only 25 minutes, 27 minutes now. So if we've not covered much, but if you've got questions, you can email either of us. We'd be glad to dialogue with you.
Yeah.
We hope to see you soon, and God bless you.
Bye-bye.